réchauffement climatique. Et malheureusement aujourd'hui, même si on a mis dans l'agenda de cette COP27 pertes et dommages, il reste malheureusement encore peu de voix qui sont entendues au niveau du nord du Tchad. Donc notre problème au niveau du nord du Tchad et spécialement dans la région du Tibesti, on utilise ce qu'on appelle le mercure. Le mercure qui est, comme vous le savez, très dangereux l'utilisation et qui affecte la santé et les populations sur les terres, qui a un impact direct sur l'environnement, la santé, qui peut créer des risques de cancer, mais aussi sur les générations futures, même si les orpaillages de l'or est très loin. Et
she's trying, so if I can help to translate briefly. So she's saying she's from the indigenous people from the northern region of Chad, and they, okay.
I'm sorry, but I think you don't need to translate because she can just speak freely. Don't bother you. Okay, just continue. Continue.
Et dans nos régions, malheureusement, on parle très peu de ces problèmes du mercure. Pourtant, le Tchad a signé la convention de Minata concernant le mercure et l'utilisation se trouve énormément, que ce soit dans les produits et au niveau de l'orpaillage de l'or. Une zone qui est très peu sécurisée. Et le problème, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, on parle de tout ce qui est conflit climatique et de réchauffement climatique. On subit les réchauffements climatiques des pays du Nord dans nos régions. Mais le souci, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, on parle très peu en fait de ma communauté qui est du nord du Tchad. On a l'avancée du désert et le reboisement qui n'est pas encore effective. Et sur cela, en tant que jeune activiste, je veux donner la voix à tous ces jeunes qui veulent s'impliquer au niveau de l'environnement parce que la justice climatique, ça inclut les femmes en premier lieu, c'est elles qui sont les premiers touchées, ça inclut les enfants. Et la justice climatique, ça passe par la santé, par l'accès à l'éducation, par l'accès à l'eau potable. Et pour pouvoir réussir à répondre aux enjeux de réchauffement climatique actuellement, nous avons besoin de pouvoir militer encore plus et porter la voix. Même si aujourd'hui on fait un premier pas au niveau de cette COP et qu'on parle des peuples indigènes qui avant n'étaient pas du tout abordés, on a besoin encore de parler, de militer encore plus pour que la voix des peuples indigènes du nord du Tchad puisse être entendue. On voudrait développer un projet d'agriculture parce qu'il ne suffit pas juste de donner de l'argent à un État pour se dire qu'on s'est félicité d'avoir donné tel budget à un État. Il faut pouvoir trouver des formations, aider les États à pouvoir se développer tout en respectant la culture et la biodiversité des endroits où on mène. Donc c'est pour ça, sur ces propos, pour la première fois, je suis représentée, comme vous pouvez voir, avec des bijoux traditionnels et je continuerai encore de me battre. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass over to Reem Shaltu. She is a young woman engineer from the UK and Egypt, and she'll be speaking about the health implications of climate change in the MENA region. Thank you.
Hi everyone. According to the World Health Organization, every second, one person is displaced by climate disasters. That's 60 in 1 minute, 3,600 in 1 hour, and 5,400 over the course of our discussion today. MENA countries are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise due to climate change. About 7% of the total population lives in areas where the elevation is less than 5 meters above sea level. The World Bank estimates that sea level rise could affect 43 port cities in the region. Algiers, Benghazi, and Alexandria are the most at risk. Alexandria could experience devastating effects with more than 2 million people displaced in a case of a 0.5 meter rise. Flooding results in mortality, morbidity, mental health implications, respiratory issues, malnutrition, and serious injury. MENA is warming at twice the global pace and could reach as much as 4 degrees and experience 10 times more frequent heat waves by 2050. According to recent study, even if global warming is limited to 2 degrees Celsius, the heat stress mortality risk for people aged 65 and over and for children is estimated to increase by 3 to 7 times in the next century. MENA region is also facing a variety of health risks that are exacerbated by the increase in temperatures. High temperatures can cause several medical conditions, including heat stress, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke, with the elderly and young and the most clinically vulnerable most at risk. The number of emergency hospital admissions has been observed to increase during heat waves by 1.47% per 1 degree Celsius increase in ambient temperature. In a 2 degrees Celsius world, the number of consecutive hot days projected to increase in several capital cities in MENA regions. For example, from 4 days to about 2 months in Amman, from 8 days to about 3 months in Baghdad, and from 1 day to 2 months in Damascus. The number of hot days in Riyadh is expected to increase even more, from about 3 days to over 4 months. And overall, the number of hot days, if we reach a 4 degrees Celsius world, is projected to be the equivalent of 4 months in the majority of MENA capital cities. Water-related diseases, including cholera, are already in effect and are predicted to continue on a rising trend, whilst water quality, water supplies, and access to sanitation are affected by climate change. It is estimated that 500 million infectious diseases, including malaria and elephantitis, are to be transmitted by mosquito transmission alone. Dengue fever is also showing rising trends since 1998 and is only predicted to increase in the coming years. Loss and damage must prioritize and must compensate for psychosocial implications caused by climate change, for both the increase in mortality and morbidity, as only when people understand and recover mentally will we be able to build resilience and move forward. We need to start building systematic healthcare resilience, else it will allow MENA countries to cope with the health risks that are now vulnerable to.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Tasneem Sabri, a UK and Egypt environmental economist. She will explain to us the scientific climate impacts in the MENA region, Bedouin populations, and the importance of inclusive women and youth projects in MENA.
In the Middle East and North Africa region, young people are the fastest growing population. Around 60% of the region's population is under the age of 25, making this region one of the most youthful worldwide, with a median age of 22 years compared to the global average of 28. How much do we value our environment? How should we value our youth? And how can we sustain our resources for future generations? The answers to these questions are all linked, yet the constraint we have is time. The science is evident. MENA is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. Despite our efforts in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, the region is warming nearly twice as fast as the global average and is projected to be at least 4 degrees warmer by 2050. This is because of the desert warming amplification phenomenon, where drying soil prevents natural cooling effects, creating a feedback loop that intensifies the heat. Heat waves are expected to occur 10 times more frequently, and future temperatures are estimated to exceed the threshold for human adaptability, causing higher mortality rates for children and the elderly. Arable lands have begun shrinking, disrupting agriculture yields, and this is set to cause significant economic losses and climate-induced migration by 2050. Due to the combination of water and precipitation scarcity, high population growth, and geographic concentration of the population, 12 out of the 17 most stressed countries worldwide are in MENA. Communities in Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Iran are parched by rising temperatures, low rainfall, and painful aridification. Lived experiences and anticipated adverse climate impacts in MENA countries are rarely considered within loss and damage discourse. The reasons for exclusion are likely complex and multifold given the economic and geopolitical turmoil underpinning the region's recent history. One lived experience here in Sina are the Bedouins who believe nature has its own language and possess valuable knowledge. This knowledge is not acknowledged by decision makers or the global climate movement. For many years, the Bedouins have wandered around the harshest desert climates across Egypt, which helped them to build a knowledge of the natural world. Traditional Bedouin gardens are one example of how Bedouin culture can offer guidance in living sustainably through their approach to rainwater harvesting, which can provide a sustainable mechanism for boosting food security in arid regions. However, this knowledge is being increasingly lost today as more Bedouins leave the desert to settle in towns due to the changing nature of the environment. Indigenous peoples and local communities play an indispensable role in protecting the biological and cultural diversity of the planet. The conversation on loss and damage is inherently about equity. It presents the question, why should countries and indigenous communities that have done little to cause global warming pay the price for the damage of wealthier nations? Loss and damage must be at the center of discussions to prevent the compromise of youth livelihoods. So what solutions are possible? We must work on capacity building and begin to integrate climate change science into school curriculums to educate the younger generations about the impacts of climate change. The youth should be the focus of environmental strategies and involved in decision-making processes for government environmental policies, since they will be the generation reaping the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to welcome A. Hazem Mohammed, a young Iraqi lawyer. She'll be discussing the climate impacts on the marshlands in Iraq and its people.
Thank you, Nora. Around the Middle East and North Africa region, protracted dry spells, heat waves, and drought have long posed challenges. However, these extremes are already intensifying as a result of climate change and has exacerbated food insecurity, water shortages, and crop failure. The impact is massive, especially on Iraq's indigenous marsh Arabs, where settled farming communities are faced with dwindling numbers of pastoralists who depend on land and water to graze their herds. The scarcity of these resources has placed their traditional way of life under strain. Hotter spells and extended periods of drought have also led to a drop in water levels, whilst at the same time the level of salinity has risen to unhealthy levels. With the temperatures currently reaching 40 degrees during the summer and is predicted to rise by 4 degrees Celsius by 2050, these effects at the current rate will only intensify in the future. As many communities are dependent on agriculture for their livelihood, and the rising temperatures of drought and more frequent sandstorms has increased the displacement and migration of the marsh Arabs. The extent of damage caused by fluctuating water levels in the marshes has driven many marsh Arabs to leave their villages and head to the inner cities to make a living, returning only seasonally when the water levels have leveled out. Iraq's ability to alleviate these impacts of climate change by modernizing water infrastructure and the agriculture sector have been debilitated by poor governance, corruption, and war. If neglected, the combination of climate change impacts, decreased water flow from neighboring countries, and poor infrastructure will create a catastrophe for the marsh Arabs. For a country like Iraq, which is already contending with a civil conflict and violence, it is now facing the added challenge of responding to the pressures of a changing climate and the accompanying social disruptions will likely create. Further competition from the neighboring countries has meant that the water flow to Iraq has been suspended. As reed production declines with its natural buffer for the hot winds, the blow through the marshes, hotter temperatures, and dust clouds from the desiccated marsh beds will have serious impacts on marsh Arab population. This can lead to respiratory sicknesses, cancer, and higher levels of infant mortality. We must combine protective management policies with the restoration of degraded areas, including enhanced pollution control, sustainable intensification of agriculture, and oil production. Such an approach will promote mitigation measures against environmental degradation in the area, including monitoring the impact of reflooding programs. It is also clear that any effective response to climate change in the region will also require meaningful collaboration between different groups, a scenario that can only be realized through transparent governance structures. The importance of an inclusive framework grounded in human rights for all, particularly minorities and indigenous people, is therefore a prerequisite for any successful adaptation strategy. Thank you.
Engineering is a huge sector, encompassing many opportunities for decarbonisation. But the interest needs to shift. It needs to shift from the desire to monetize off of sustainability changes to a genuine desire to decarbonise the sector and reduce the impacts of such projects. The focus needs to shift to benefit the climate and the people, and not just corporations and individuals that are in power. If we create these amazing solutions and amazing technology, or like new materials, that are simply unaffordable, then the people that will be able to benefit from them is significantly reduced. And this means that this innovation is likely to reach its full capacity and we're not likely to benefit from it as much as we could. For example, there was actually a scheme set out in Egypt to provide families in Egypt access to housing loans. And this was to act as an incentive to buy into sustainable housing projects and add green elements to people's lives. However, this wasn't actually deemed cost effective and faced many operational challenges, and ultimately the project did not progress. If such projects could be scaled up with the correct governance, management, and funding, then many countries in the region would follow, and such projects could introduce very large-scale change. And it's as much as it is about government, it's about finance. There are currently mega-scale projects being introduced in Egypt, one of which is a new industrial city known as TERRE. It's a project set out over 190 million meters squared, so it's a very large-scale project and would probably be the first of its kind in the region. Now, the problem is, well, not the best thing about these kind of projects is that they're aiming to be sustainable, achieving inclusion and sustainable economic growth, and it would be the first of its kind. With industrialization being such a key focus for the economic development of countries in the MENA region, we need to focus on making sustainability attainable, whilst incorporating things that actually benefit the people and helping people to develop. In doing so, we need to change people's views. And what I mean by that is often with sustainability, people see it as additional costs, people see it as carbon taxing, people see it as more constraints. When in fact, if we portray sustainability in a way that allows people to see it as a way for people to get more human rights, for people to get fair wages, then we're more likely to incentivize the people in these countries to become involved with sustainability projects, and we're likely to reach a much wider audience. We need to push that this means food security, it means energy security, it means inclusion and just approaches, to ultimately provide people with more incentives for change. Which takes me to the point that I won't delve into too much, but at the pinnacle of the change in the MENA region is the changes that we need to the education systems. We need to provide robust education for everyone so that these projects and such things can actually progress. People everywhere need to be educated so that we can start seeing solutions that are best for the people first. Thank you, and I'd now like to introduce Islam, an Egyptian entrepreneur based in the UK and part of the Invisibles movement. He will address the current dilemmas and impacts on Egypt.
Thank you, Noura. Thank you, Noura, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Islam. I'm a nutritionist. I will tell you about the effect of the increase in the temperature in the food system and the food chain, and the effect of that into the health system. The increase of the temperature has a catastrophic event globally, and every region is affected in different ways. We need to act together, we need to act now, and we can't really waste more time. There is a lot of contribution into the climate problematic, and in particular I will tell you what's happening on the sea, on the river, and how this is affecting the life of the people. The temperature is linked to an increase in the evaporation rate of water in rivers, in lakes. This is then affecting the amount of water that can go to the local population, to agriculture, to those communities that live by farming, and therefore is deteriorating the quality of their life. They can't live without water. The sea level is increasing faster. Every day we are losing miles, not only in Egypt or in the MENA region, but everywhere. We are losing arable lands. We are losing the opportunities to produce enough food for a fast-growing population. Coastal erosion is a real problem and is coming with more side effects, like an increased salination in the region. The Nile is also experiencing changes in the flood, and this is affecting the rate of the farming accessing water. Therefore, the irrigation system is compromised. They need to find alternative resolutions that, with the technologies available at the moment and with more economic support, can really be a game changer. In terms of the coastal sides effect, we have an increase in the wave strength. We have an increase in the wave power. We have an increase in the current power, which is devastating the cities like Alexandria or other realities. Therefore, the government needs to invest every year more and more to protect their people. There is obviously an impact on food production, and this is affecting the quality of the health, not only physical health, but also the mental health is a big issue. And those that are mostly at risk are women and kids. Globally, we are losing 400 million hectares on the planet just because of the rate of salination. And this is leading to increased land scarcity. And with the augmented salinity, we are losing soil fertility. Therefore, we have a reduction in the plant growth and the quantity of the nutrients in the plant. This is linked to increased amount of nutrient and micronutrient deficiencies. And again, that's a strong, devastating impact on the health. Egypt has been losing in the last decades between 30 to 40% of the land on the delta, which was the mostly used land for those purposes. And with the increased salinity on the upper soil, is harder to keep going without adjusting the selection of crops that we are having. We need to find more salt-resistant crops to satisfy the demand. The increase in temperature is also linked to problematic event in terms of rains. And the acidity of the rains as well has been a big issue, not only because of the agricultural side, but Egypt is famous for the monument. And those monuments, because of the increased acidity, are at risk. So the local population is also losing the tourism on top of the agriculture and the aquaculture realities that were vital for their survival. We are having a big problem with flies. And it's devastating the fact that those realities that are the most affected.
I'm sorry, I know that you have a lot of things to say, but the time is limited.
Okay.
Please,
so
finish.
those realities that are a bit more devastated, like the fisheries, are also facing the problem of the reduction in biodiversity in environment. This is affecting the quantity of the fish and therefore impacting the availability of food. So we have problems related to food coming from the seaside, coming from the farming, coming from a number of directions that are detrimental to the local population, not only in Egypt. The resolution can be not only support coming from financial institutions.
So sorry, Islam. Really sorry, just for the interest of keeping on time, but thank you very much. Fantastic. I'd now like to open up the panel to any questions. Has anyone got any questions for the panel from the audience? Okay, fantastic. We'll welcome the speakers for part 2 of the session, please. Thank you.
Honorable co-chair, participants, dear guests. The second session is called The Diplomacy Angle, What COP Must Achieve. The speakers will approach the duty of the politicians in this very critical climate moment of the mankind. The scientists have declared that 1.5 degrees warming is a bearable limit and that was accepted on the previous COPs. Now, we must keep 1.5 degrees alive, especially now when the massive energy crisis and the search for resources of any kind is burning our hope, when all the long-term tremendous efforts of a mass of scientists, activists, politicians, and honest people may collapse. Now, allow me to share our thoughts as a Green Economics Institute on the role of diplomacy in this moment. My name is Liljana Popovska. I'm former MP from Macedonia, and I'm environmental and climate researcher and specialist. The title of my speech is Our Fight for Sharp and Precise Formulations Without Diplomatic Euphemisms. The scientific reports show that we are missing decisive actions. Instead of a progress in stricter limitations and ban of all fossil fuels, ironically, we are facing a thirst and battle for more and more fossils of any kind, including the coal. After decades of severe fights against the nuclear plants, we see a new revival with a new definition of nuclear as a green energy. It seems like the words of the scientists have partly lost their power and relevancy. Here comes the role of the politics and politicians, in which hands literally lays the future of our planet. Last year in Glasgow, we were fighting for the meaning of the words, how to strengthen the formulations in the Climate Pact and make them effective tools for saving the Earth, to have coal out instead of coal down, to have measurable funds for adaptation and not only process which is strongly encouraged. But the complot of industry and politics diluted the words and the actions. That's why now in Egypt, the diplomacy has a duty to make the words sharper and more precise, to count contributions for loss and damage, reaching the ultimate climate goals, and without diplomatic euphemisms and acrobatics this time, please. The milestone of the COP27 is the finance of the climate action. The expert reports say that the finances are not collected as planned and the promises are far from delivering. Mainly public money, not enough private. Loss and damage of vulnerable countries and communities are part of the story, but not with a deep reach. More go for mitigation than to adaptation. A lot of irrelevant projects which are missing the point of serious climate action. Now, when the climate changes are visible and understandable for ordinary people, and they are raising their voices, the politician must listen to their diverse local problems and act to solve them. And not imaginary problems, but real. The negotiators at COP27 must create a trustable financial mechanism for following the income and spending of the money for loss and damage of undeveloped countries. It should be based on science to be able to overcome gap in mitigation and adaptation. The underdeveloped countries also need expert help in creating precise plans to be able to use real money for real problems. This financial mechanism is important also for the sake of transparency, which is necessary to stimulate easier collecting of funds in the future. And not only for public funds from the citizens, but much more private. The role of the politics is crucial to create local and global surrounding for destimulation of the fossil businesses and support of the clean and sustainable ones. Finally, financial mechanism for spending according to real needs of the local people, with an accent to adaptation before mitigation and scientific plans for loss and damage. We want to roll back the tide and stop runaway climate change. We want to make certain we limit it to 1.5 degrees, which means serious action to stop the burning critical now, not in 10 years' time. The best cure for loss and damage is avoidance of loss and damage. So, avoiding climate or any further climate change or warming is needed. We want this COP to do that. These are the expectations of the Green Economics Institute from the COP27, and anything beyond it will not be satisfactory. Thank you. This was my approach in the name of Green Economics Institute. And now I call Mrs. Catherine Henneberger, member of German Parliament, responsible for topic climate justice and climate policy, to give her speech. Please.
Hello, thank you so much that I can be here. I hope you can hear me well. Perfect. So I was told that I should talk about climate diplomacy, but the truth is I'm still a climate justice activist, now sitting in a German parliament representing the voices of civil society of my region. And my region is a coal region in the west of Germany. We have the biggest coal mines, the biggest polluter of coal power plants. So we say to our region it's kind of the source of CO2 in Europe, the hotspot. And so we feel, of course, responsible for the climate crisis, and we feel that it's our responsible to act for a coal phase out in our region, and also, of course, worldwide. And we pushed hard, and our enemy was, I have to be true with that, the fossil fuel industry. We pushed hard. We organized a lot of demonstration and occupation. And then I also went into the German parliament 1 year ago to represent my region. And we had some victories. We saved five villages from getting destroyed from the coal mine. We saved a huge forest, but it's not enough. Last week, we declared as Germany that we want to resign from the Energy Charter Treaty, a treaty which protects the invest of the fossil fuel industry worldwide. But still, even if this is a huge win, it's not enough. It's not enough to make sure that we don't reach the 1.5 degrees. And so we feel more and more responsible for acting against the fossil fuel industry. And I think this is also the true responsibility of us, green members of the parliament, green politicians worldwide, to be the voices and to stand against the fossil fuel industry. At the same time, of course, we have to face reality, the cruel reality of the climate crisis. And also, Germany cannot be blind facing the climate crisis, facing also that other regions of the world are getting destroyed already. And so we are in favor of a loss and damage finance facility. 1 week ago, also in the German parliament, we voted in favor of creating a loss and damage finance facility. 1 year ago, it was not the case. And we did a lot of education work in the German parliament, organized hearings, open hearings. We organized conference, invited people of the most affected areas in this world to give them a voice, a place to speak up. And so we convinced other members of the parliament also to be in favor of a loss and damage finance facility. And I think this is also our responsible, wherever we are as green politicians, in which parliament we sit, we had to create space there for other voices. And we have to be the change. And so I want to end with that. And I thank you so much for being here. And I'm looking forward to work with you all.
Thank you, Catherine. She was representative from the partner of the Green Economics Institute, Global Greens, and from the same partner comes also Ms. Lucy Kagendo, co-convener for Global Greens Working Group COP27, then Gender Secretary at the Green Congress of Kenya since 2016, and also environmental activist on climate, food security, disability, kitchen gardens in school, and participants into COPs. Madame Kagendo, please take a floor.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Now I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for the time you've taken to come and listen to us. I know the benefits of the climate policies are very important and determinants of the level, type, and timing of policies that the government should understand to address the climate change. Climate change is just not the changing of the weather. Its consequences are a daily reality to the millions of people around the world. more so in Africa, and I come from Kenya. And so I'm going to share just a bit of experience of what we, in Africa and also in Kenya more, what we faced through. And my specialty is more on gender and dealing with the children. So when the intense rains fall frequently, causing the floods, or spells of the drought last several years, like now we have a drought, it's usually the women and girls that struggle to survive and recover from the aftermath. This is because women and girls are already facing inequalities in our societies and discrimination because of the gender, which is a compound and multiply when the disaster strikes. From my work and experience, I know that the climate change-related crises are already instigating deep, life-altering changes for some of the poorest and most marginalized women and girls in the world, and also in Kenya, to be more precise. And just to say a few of the things that we find these girls and women face, we get increased violence against women and girls. We also get increased risk of girls getting married. We also get, and also, like for example, when the houses are marooned into the water, parents tend to struggle. Hence, the young women and girls are forced into early marriages, and in order to survive. So the parents, you find, they'll sell their kids, they marry their girls off so that they can be able to earn a living out of it. So you can see the struggles of the African woman and the girl, which is very intense because of climate change. The children also more likely to miss classes and drop out of school because their parents are not able to feed them. Increased risk of death and injury to the marginalized women and girls, and also the disabled and the elderly in the community, which is actually a very big problem. It also affects the availability of food and chances of earning a living because of all these scenarios that we are having. So I'll just give a scenario where you can imagine that you live in a pastoral farming. You're in pastoral or a farming community that is in Kenya or anywhere in Africa. The food you eat every day comes from the crops you grow daily and the livestock. So you get your milk, you get your meat, or selling, or whatever cash you get out of it, then you're able to buy your dairy feeds. Now imagine the same land you're relying on slowly dries out or gets inducted with water and destroys a season's worth of crops. What happens? The people have no food, so that's why they have problems all the time. This is the reality facing the African girls whose parents are pastoralists and or rely on the farm produce and animals. I can go on and on. We need to task our governments, individuals, organizations to be part of the journey. During elections, we should also ask candidates about their agendas on climate change. We cannot treat climate issues as emergencies, which we have seen in most of these African countries. We need to plan for them in advance, and that's why we need more of this climate. We need more of green parties, green party members in different parliaments, not only in Africa, but also in other developed countries. At GDN, we encourage and mentor children to take care of the environment by adopting indigenous trees and fruits and startup kitchens, gardens, and helping to solve the DGN number 2. I wish to appreciate the work of the kids and the youth that they're doing. To mention a few, we have Karen Kimani, a 9-year-old, who was the youngest UNFC accredited member by the Young Global Greens. We have Tamara Moshe, who is 18 years old, and we have a boy who is 10 years old. I can go on, the list is big, and we want to tell them, thank you for taking care of our health, and I think it's time for action, and we cannot put a borderline, say climate change and politics. We are here. If you're not a party and you're an observer, there's a difference. I'm sure most of you, you cannot go to the negotiating table. So we need to bring politics into this agenda.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Kagendo. Another partner of the Green Economics Institute on COP27 is ERINA, or Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia. And the last two speakers are speaking in front of this institution. First is Dr. Badjargal Zamba, Chief Science Advisor, Climate Change Research and Cooperation Center in the Ministry of Environment and Tourism of Mongolia. Please. And they will speak together with Dr. Enghbayar Shagdar, Senior Research Fellow, Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, ERINA from Japan. Please. We have some technical stuff to fix. I think it will be okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Ms. Moderator, for your kind introduction. Last moment I was informed that time is very limited, but also I was informed that I have to talk a little bit about science and technology in relation with climate change concern. And prepared a few slides, but in order to save time, I will very quickly move those slides. And I just brought some slides from a presentation I made in last September at the Science Summit, which was held in New York in conjunction with UN General Assembly, and something related to policy on climate change in Mongolia, which have some innovation elements and so on. But when we are talking about climate change, of course, we have to know what we are expecting and what kind of risk we will have. And the Mongolian scientists made some assessments of risk by 2050. Of course, the situation is much worse than in comparison with the current situation and so on. I just will not, and different component of environment and different sector of economy in social life, including human health and so on. But Mongolia is contributing, of course, to the global GHG pool. In that way, you can see, for example, the capital city of Ulaanbaatar of Mongolia is how this city only is contributing to the GHG pool atmosphere depending on season and day night time. Of course, we have enough policy documents, and including Vision 2050 and so on. But unfortunately, most of the documents just very nicely written tasks and goals without any guarantee will be implemented, because no any clearly defined financial support and technology and know-how and so on. And just one example, for example, in order to implement NDC target by 2030, we need around more than $11 billion money. And in order to implement some targets up to 25, we need more $8 billion money and so on. And still we don't know how we can get those amount of money. But government is trying to do something, and for example, by the initiative of President of Mongolia, we are now starting so-called Billion Trees campaign, and thanks to the GHG removals, now we can talk about possible net zero by the mid of the century. And some calculations showed that even if we succeed to implement this project, we can even achieve net zero target in the planned time frame.
These are great
And
results. I'm sorry, can you wrap up and
Okay,
finish,
good.
please?
And for us, climate change related issues the water, and therefore especially big projects called Blue Horse. And we are not going to spend a lot of money in order to construct huge concrete dams. We just want to use more natural setting rather than artificial dams. And recently, government developed a new revival policy which included everything, including to become digital nation and so on. And just the last concluding sentence, I should tell that we need some radical change in policy and action based on more innovative approach. And as an example, I would like to refer to the next slide from the next presentation, which should be made by Dr. Inkmeyer. Such kind of innovative ideas and approaches can find partners in Mongolia for joint research and for continued experimenting ground. But this one is
thank you, sir.
called plasma technology, and I think Dr. Inkmeyer would introduce now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, Dr. Enkbayar Shagdar, Senior Research Fellow, Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, ERINA, from Japan. Please.
Sorry. So as introduced, my name is Inkmeyer. I am from the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, located in Niigata city of Japan. So my presentation is breakthrough technology for circular economy. So I would like to introduce one of the exciting technology which is already available in the market. So, as we all know, the carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions are the main cause of current climate and other related crises. This is because the industrial process we have now today is still incomplete, and the final byproduct of these processes, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, are emitted to the atmosphere without treatment. But the good news is that advanced technologies that can potentially fix that problem is already in the pipeline. For example, cold plasma filter developed by Japanese scientists can decompose carbon dioxide and capture carbon and release only oxygen into the atmosphere. The captured carbon then can be used for other industrial products and fuels. Therefore, the carbon dioxide is no longer a greenhouse gas emission, but would be a potential and important resource for industrial cycle. A schematic diagram of a fossil fuel powered power plant with carbon dioxide decomposition unit is demonstrated here. Cold plasma filter can be directly installed just prior to the flue gas is released into the atmosphere. This technology can also be applicable for agriculture by decomposing methane in addition to carbon dioxide. The cold plasma filter is already a new technology for the market, but several pilot units have been already installed in a cement factory in China and also at the thermal power plant in the US. So last week, we have demonstrated a unit that can potentially decompose carbon dioxide emitted by humans, as shown in the middle, the white one. And also, there's another product that uses cold plasma filter, which is, it's in my hand. This sterilizes the air, indoor air, purifies air and surface. So this unit is designed for room, this guy for 10 square meters, and larger units are already installed at Japanese hospitals, hotels, factories, warehouses, schools, shopping malls, etc. So transfer of such advanced technologies to developing countries are crucial to meet our common climate and sustainable development goals. The technology and project development partners in Japan are listed here on the right side, and Mongolia is a potential destination to transfer this technology to address the problem, the country's problem just mentioned by Dr. Bacharal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any question? If not, we are following the third session, and I ask anybody who will have to speak in the third session to come here, and also there will be change of the chair. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Ann Githu. I'm from Kenya. I'm a climate activist, and I'm also a visual storyteller based both in Kenya and the UK. My work surrounds the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and Goal 13, climate change, has been very important to me and to the people I work with, because it carries all the other goals with it, you know, poverty, education, health. There is something that will be solved if we solve Goal 13. So it's very important for us and for the people seated on this table today to talk about climate change and what we are doing in our specific areas. So I'll introduce the speakers today. So we have Dr. Ram Boj. Dr. Ram is from India. He works with a sustainability think tank in India called Mondiaux Foundation, and he has also worked with UNESCO for over 2 decades. So we'll be very lucky to get his knowledge. Welcome, Dr. Bom. Yes, next to Dr. Bom, we have Jessica Pinheiro from Brazil. She's a graduate student at the United Nations University in Bonn, and she's studying environmental risks and human security. Welcome, Jessica. And to the far end, we have Colin Shava from Mid-Zambezi Valley in Zimbabwe, and he's an African youth expert. And today he'll be representing the African Wildlife Foundation. So welcome, speakers. and Noura will be assisting me to manage the session. So Dr. Baum, please go ahead.
Hello everyone, good evening. Today is a very important day in the negotiations that is happening with the delegations, that is parties. In fact, topic of this session is burning critical, where science leads and where must politics dare to go. So it's a challenge to all those negotiators. But the last part, reversing loss and damage. Basically, entire debate on loss and damage is about compensating. And that too, this debate is going on for many years, I think more than a decade now, compensating or based on the polluter's pay principle, equity as well as common but differentiated responsibility. But I think this very diplomatically the topic is reversing loss and damage, which I think that suits to the negotiators, because those countries who has to pay for the damages which is happening, both intensity and frequency is increasing every year, and they are becoming very critical. And science is very clear about, during the negotiation process, many delegates, they raise the questions about how to calculate these loss and damage, number one, and number two, what kind of compensatory mechanism has to be there. There was a Warsaw mechanism that was developed in 2013, and this whole science of what we call as attribution science, or apportionment of the damages, particularly resource appropriation, this is very well established, and that can be easily, science can easily deal with it. However, the more question is, the whole diplomacy, the politics is, I think it's not favoring this. That is why I think those who have decided about this topic, reversing, is about what we call as reducing the disasters, risk reduction. It's a very mild one, not very, I would say, the word what most of the youth groups and developing countries are those who are most vulnerable societies, both indigenous groups, island nations, they all want this. So this is one. See, loss and damage is of many types. In fact, if you want to reverse, the critical is, as has been very rightly said, the nature. How we can restore ecosystems. Around 1 million species are at the verge of extinction. So it's rightly said that our fight against nature must stop. So we must restore most of those hotspot areas, whether it's in the mountains, in the lands, in the aquatic systems or oceans. That is where we can build the ecosystem, and then we can definitely reverse loss and damage. That is the critical, most critical one. The next part to reverse the damage is reduce the emissions at all levels. In fact, this is the first time that some breakthrough, of course Glasgow was one where there was a very clear-cut agreement, and now this net zero has got the momentum, and I think by 2030 many countries are going to achieve almost more than 50 to 80%, it ranges, the reduction in the carbon emissions. So that is very critical. The third very important aspect is building the resilience. That is what adaptation. Mitigation is okay. Net zero is all about mitigation. But definitely this should go hand in hand with adaptation. How
Thank
you
you very
build
much. So sorry
the
to interrupt you.
resilience of the systems, the humans, and that is why the Government of India's this mission, lifestyle for environment, is very critical. We have to, because even if countries achieve net zero, the emissions in the atmosphere has to remain there for hundreds of years. And that is where we must build the resilience, our capacity to adapt to certain situations and restore the ecosystems. I think that is the only way we can reverse the loss and damage. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you everyone. So it's been great to hear from all of the other panelists giving us a different perspective of where we must go with loss and damage. And when we talk about it, we're talking about both the direct and indirect impacts of both slow onsets and also extreme events. But when we talk about the quantification of these, it gets a little more complicated, especially when we include the fact that both the public and the private sector both seek for metrics that provide the least amount of uncertainty. And that's where climate risk modeling comes in. So in the work that I do, my job is to take the data and transform it into insights that are useful for policymakers to take action to reduce climate risk. So I was very happy to see the representative of Mongolia talking a little bit about future-oriented risk assessments. And also I want to echo some of the words that Dr. Ram just mentioned here, that we need to have mitigation and adaptation hand in hand. Because when we talk about climate risk modeling, we try to visualize and understand the relationship between the damages seen by climate-induced events and the conditions of those exposed to it. But there are a couple of challenges that we see on it. The first challenge is the quantification of damages. That quantification is uncertain, and a lot of the times we use monetary amounts or GDP to quantify damages, but there's a lot more damage that is caused by climate change that is not reflected in risk modeling, such as environmental impacts, emotional and psychological impacts caused by displacement, as we heard in our first session, and other impacts that just simply aren't quantified. The second challenge is that most climate risk models today are still very much focused on the frequency and magnitude of events and how climate change is impacting those too. But we need more. We need the social, we need the economic and the environmental factors that can impact the way in which something or someone can suffer from climate change and how they can suffer loss and damage. And the third is that when we try to include this data, we come to the third challenge, which is the bias in the data. Most openly available data sets are either incomplete or aggregated. So for example, when we look at the number of women that are single mothers, this data most often is not specific to race, age, or social status. And this implies that all women who lead a family alone have the same capacity to cope with climate risk, which is simply not the case. But how can we address these challenges? So what I propose is that we need to transform climate risk analytics through intersectionality. One, we need new metrics to assess loss and damage. There has been recent developments on trying to find different indices to quantify it, but we're still lacking a more holistic approach to this. This is why we need to include more work in ecosystem services, social well-being, and traditional knowledge. All need to come together with statisticians, economists, data scientists, lawyers, so that we can come up with a more accurate metric. There was a UN big data analysis report on COP speeches from COP24 to COP26, and it has shown that only 16% of countries mention gender in their speeches related to climate change. There needs to be more of an effort to produce data sets that are age, race, and gender disaggregated, and this starts from the ground up. This is what is meant by intersectionality, this idea that we're all interconnected. Social categorizations such as age, race, gender, and class all impact one another, and therefore solutions cannot be linear. They need to be intersectional and adaptive. Lastly, we need more representation at the decision-making and the tool production table. We don't just need more partnerships between the private and public sector. We need academia and communities that are impacted to be involved at all parts of the process. We need women to speak of the needs of women, Indigenous communities to speak on the needs of their communities, and youth to speak of the needs of the future, since we're the generation that will be able to witness it all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. My name is Collins from the African Wildlife Foundation. And I'll speak from a wildlife perspective and also from the work that we do with the communities in the Mid-Zambezi Valley, in Zimbabwe, and other parts of Zimbabwe that we work. And my interest basically is why climate change is one of the main drivers of which is affecting our ecosystems. It is leading to increased extinction rates, changes in distribution of species, decimating wildlife populations, and changing in lengths of growing seasons for plants, among other things. And in addition, it is also exerting a lot of pressure, which is more importantly to the communities that live around wildlife areas, that live around biodiversity areas. And climate change as well is also increasing, being a threat to biodiversity as vegetation zones and habitats are changing for many species, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And we can see that we are going to have a large number of extinction, or a large rate of extinction in the next 10 to 15 years if nothing is done to address issues of climate change. And biodiversity loss will mean a lot to the people in Africa. It will mean a lot to communities that depend on their economic outputs on it. And that means that given the high dependence on natural resources in the continent, many people in the rural communities will be vulnerable to the loss of natural resources due to climate change. And in addition, we can see already that the communities are already affected. The communities that we work with are already affected, like what happened in Zimbabwe in Cyclone Idai when it happened in 2019, and 1,400 people lost their lives. So those are the key things that we should look at. We should look at the biodiversity loss, we should look at the communities itself, and loss and damage, whatever is being discussed right now by the politicians, must have that human face. It must have that biodiversity face to look at what is happening within the sub-Saharan Africa. And my key ask from this is to ensure that the politicians, whatever we're going to come up with from this end, we need to, one, facilitate the regeneration of forests and the protection of biodiversity. We must support the indigenous people who are protecting our biodiversity. Secondly, we must build resilience, capacity for resilience for our communities. We must build awareness amongst our communities, and the financial mechanisms for loss and damage that will be agreed on this COP must take into account that the finance must be grants and it must not be loans. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Budge, Jessica, and Collins, because the points that they have been raised over and over again in this meeting and also in other sessions around the COP. The general consensus is that loss and damage, or rather climate finance in general, needs to be addressed. Actually, it needs to be operationalized so that communities can, survive and adapt and have enough money to put it where it's needed so that these problems can be solved. So just to add on what Colin said, growing up in Kenya, I can see the change from when I was probably 5 years old, when we had seasons confirmed and we knew when to plant, we knew when to harvest. Everything was working like clockwork. But today, climate has changed. We don't know when rain is coming. We have areas in Kenya that have not seen rain in 4 years. you can imagine such a community that depends on agriculture to feed their people. What are they supposed to do? You know, governments can do so much, but sometimes they don't reach the communities, the vulnerable communities, all the way in the villages. So what has happened now in Kenya, if I take Kenya as the case study, people are finding local solutions for their local problems to adapt to the local issues in their areas. But this is very small scale, and considering that the funds are not flowing all the way to the grassroots, it's becoming a very big problem. We have a good system in Kenya. The government has been very supportive in pushing for environmental policies, and Kenya is one of the leading countries in renewable energy in Africa. But the people on the grassroots want to know that the knowledge they have, or rather the practices that they are putting in their local areas, are being adapted from the bottom up. Because if you start from up, you'll apply technology, you'll bring, knowledge that they're not able to apply. So these local solutions need to be adapted and pushed up to actually contribute to including the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, because we don't want commitments to be made at the top by governments, but when you come to the local people, they have no idea what to do. Then the countries end up not meeting their NDCs because they're not spreading the commitments around to their communities. So these are some of the things that we are advocating for. And finally, as activists, we have a duty. It's great that we are here at COP27, but we also need to go back with this information to the people who really need it, because not everybody can get to COP. So we need to share this knowledge, share ways. For example, I had one lady mention outside, well, we can do these carbon credits, but what are they, So it's something that if the person growing the trees in the land, in the villages, if they know what to do, then they will be participating wholly, because some of our communities are very positive about this. They're very optimistic communities. So we need to share this knowledge as much as we can with the communities that are, vulnerable communities that are implementing these issues on the ground. So Noura, maybe you could look at the questions.
Yes, thank you. I think we're just opening up to the audience now, so if anyone has any questions, then please present them to the panel.
So do we have any questions in the room? Any questions for the team up here? Yes? Sorry, we can't hear you.
Thank you. In this last week, what is the best takeaway for each one of you, please?
Okay. For me, the biggest takeaway is how vulnerable communities, because I've been having a lot of conversations with especially the Global South, the youth, the women from the Global South who are here at the COP. Most of them are very hopeful. We are hoping that the governments in the negotiations table will make the right commitments, and these negotiations will be, will bring the results that we are all expecting. But my takeaway is the hope that this is the implementation COP, because you cannot keep discussing and hoping and believing that things will get better. So I believe that this hope also is driving decisions, because there is pressure to do good.
For me, it will be the conversations around Indigenous people and local communities, and the potential which I've heard from different conversations which they have in protecting the biodiversity and also in implementing climate action. And I'm also for the conversation that has been building up to say finances must go to the indigenous people and the local communities because they have the right and they have the resources and they are the ones who contribute to those to protection of those resources. Thank you.
I think I have two main takeaways. The first is that I would like to see more representation in the negotiation rooms, and the global north and south divide is still very much present, and it can lead to negotiations spending hours discussing, whether or not they have to, submit a report, and the global south wanting it sooner and the global north wanting it later. And it's going to continue being like that until we start having more representation from these vulnerable communities that my colleagues mentioned in the negotiation tables. That's my main takeaway in that sense, but I think the biggest one that I take home is that the real action happens in the pavilions. It happens where we meet the people who are actually doing work on the ground, the initiatives that people are doing, and the knowledge sharing. COP is supposed to be for negotiation, but for me, COP is really about educating ourselves and really getting to know what people are really doing to actually tackle climate change.
I think one of the important takeaway from this whole exercise, COP, of course, I have been attending this on behalf of UNESCO, that's UN system, so that was different. But the vibrancy of the civil society and youth, I think that is the only hope. That is number one, I think, most important takeaway. Negotiations, I think nobody is very, very hopeful that something revolutionary will come out. But definitely the kind of vibrancy that youth and civil society has shown, that is very encouraging. The other thing is, this is implementation COP, and particularly the kind of innovations that you see in the green zone and many other pavilions, the science and innovation that is happening around the world. I think that is another takeaway for every one of us, particularly those who are in the academics, to take forward this whole mission of building a better planet. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have one more question here.
So my question is, because everyone here on the panel is from different nations and different countries, how can we ensure that there is climate finance transparency and that the funds do reach the local communities? Do we need to reform the climate finance framework, or do we need to build on what we have to ensure that it's reaching the right people?
All right. So for climate finance, yes, there's a lot of lack of transparency. Like I talked about carbon credits and people who really want to, figure out how this is working and how they can participate and sell, carbon credits. But that transparency, if you look at the high level of negotiations, they have the idea, but the people on the ground don't have that. And one of the issues that has been talked about over not just this COP, but other COPs as well, is whether the funds will go to the right places. So that actually, I think it will be very much politically motivated and ensuring that a lot of people have seats in the table. For example, the youth, the communities, the civil society, the government itself. So if we have like all stakeholders on the table, I think the finance issue, the transparency on the finance issue can be solved. Otherwise, it's a very confusing issue and it's delaying everything because these funds are not flowing because the negotiators are not agreeing on this issue of transparency.
And if I can add quickly, I think negotiations have been trying for 4 years to even define what climate finance is. And there's a lot of talk about double counting. So for example, if a country is giving funds for development, but it somehow ends up being sustainable, they'll sometimes double count that fund. So I think that there needs to be agreement first on what climate finance actually means, what's being counted for that, so that then we can ensure that it goes to the right people, as you mentioned. But for that, I 100% agree that there needs to be more transparency. And I hope that with this COP, we're able to at least agree on that.
Yeah, I'll also just add from the two colleagues to say for me it will be an issue of how do we also remove the barriers already existing within some of those financial mechanisms that are already existing that hinder local communities from accessing directly the funding. The requirements are even out of reach for some developing countries already. So it's also problematic for even local communities or local NGOs to also access some of those funding or local initiatives as well. So I'll just add to the two. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to say something? All right. Okay, so thank you for that. The issue of finance, as we have discussed here, it's quite touchy, and we hope that more pressure can be applied from all sides, because this is the only way that we'll achieve progress in pushing the money to the people who need it. So do we have any other question today? Yes, Aslam.
How important is international cooperation outside of the delegation, so from the ground? How effective can the collaboration between green economic institutes and other organizations, NGOs, local businesses be relevant outside of the delegation's talk?
I think this is happening at various levels. Other than the UN system and a few networks, there have not been any serious effort to, I think, come out with a global coalition of all those organizations working for the climate change. I think that some way that should be facilitated, and that's very much needed, because many of these organizations, they are working, there are, I think, close to some 30, 40 networks working on climate action. And I don't know if there has been any effort to bring them together. And this is a very good question. And I think from this platform, if we can somehow bring forth this point by next COP in Dubai, if there could be a coalition or some kind of network of all the global network of all those working in this area, that's very important. And from this platform, let's start doing this. At least we all exchange our notes, emails, and gradually, I think, once this is 1 year time, and we start working from today, then I think many will come up. So I volunteer for this. Any other? Yes, let's start doing this.
So sorry, I think that's all we have time for at the moment. Just wanted to say a massive thank you for everyone for joining us today. And it really is amazing to have heard the perspective of so many different people. And I think ultimately we've seen that despite these differences in background, gender, we all have the same goal for change. It's now about making sure that beyond COP, action is taken to make these changes. We can't just be creating pledge after pledge. We're at a point where all these pledges now need actioning, and we need to stop other countries from suffering as a result of the actions happening in the richer countries. The key is inclusion, diversity, and alternative voices at the heart of the decision-making and financial decisions.